All right, so let's move on. Let's move forward, and let's start styling some of those sections that we had just discussed and using box model principles. So let's go ahead and take a live preview. All right, let's get that open. This is what we currently have. We have a bunch of stuff that looks all run together, right? Because remember we had created the reset. All right, and also as a reminder, we're in live preview here because we're looking at that 127 number instead of the word file with a bunch of forward slashes. Okay, so this is our live preview window, and if we were to go and make any changes, here let's close it up a little bit. Let's do this a little sort of side by side, and we're going to have some restrictions here because we have two documents open side by side. So if you wanted, you could do a few different things to make your browser window fit a little bit better and more easily as you're going back and forth. My screen is kind of small for the sake of doing a video that is not gigantic, and also so you can see it a little bit better. But yours is probably bigger unless you're on a very small laptop. So what you can do is you can go up here in brackets to view, and you can tell it first of all to hide the sidebar, right? So it gets rid of that sidebar. If you want to get it back, you can always go back up to view again and say show sidebar, and it also has a keyboard command as well. All right, so that helps us a little bit if we really want to keep the side-by-side view. The other thing that we could do if we would need to, close it up horizontally a little bit is we could go over to view, and instead of vertical split, we could choose horizontal split. That's another option too. And then that way we can close this up a little bit. And now we've got two views at the same time, but with a little bit more space now. Okay, so one of the things in the example that I'd shown you is that these articles didn't all just run together like this. They kind of stood off the side a little bit, and they had a little bit of space in between them vertically. So let's just do that before we start messing around with all this other formatting. And let's find the place that we would need to make that change. So if you were to look at your HTML, and by the way, this is a good example of when it would be nice to have these things collapsed so that you can see, the main areas that you would want to style. Because right now, what we really need to be looking at, for instance, is like, okay, well, this is an article, and you can see if I click it, it highlights it over here with a blue outline in the live view, and it's inside of the section whose ID is content and so forth, right? So what I want to do is I want to create rules that are going to take the articles, each one of these articles that's in the section whose ID is content, and I want to make it so that those will sort of stand off a little bit, and that means I need to scroll down. All right, we don't want the banner section styling, we want the content section styling. And so right now we have a section content article rule, which is right here on my line 43 that we created, and we gave it a background number, a background color. Now let's also just go ahead and tell it that we want it to do some other stuff. For instance, let's tell it that we want the width to be a certain width. Well, pretty intuitively, the way that you would do that is with a property called width. All right, and it starts to auto hint, and I can pull that right up. And with width, you're going to be able to do it in either pixels or ems or percentages. Now, if you remember back to our lecture, pixels are going to be a very fixed size. It's a specific size. That means that the content won't flow, it won't change as you change the browser width. It'll always be a certain dimension. I want to make it a percentage. I like the idea of making it a percentage because then it will, for the most part, it'll give me the same dimensions no matter what size my browser is, so that if someone's resizing it, it'll still uphold those dimensions. So let's try that. Let's do something like, I don't know, 80%. And then you see what it does. It over here, it shows me now I've got 20% left off to the right side. Well, I want it centered. So in order to center something that is a block level element, what you have to do is you have to give it margins. And the reason that you would want to give it a margin instead of, say, just padding, for instance, is that you want it to have space around the outside of it. So if we're talking about the box model, one of the things that you need to remember is that padding refers to the inside of the element. It's sort of like if you're talking about a person's body, for instance, and let's say the person's body is the element. If you're going to eat a lot of cookies, right, you're going to fill up your internal padding, right? You're physically going to grow in size. Whereas if you're talking about margin, you're talking about the outside, or you're talking about maybe someone's personal space. So if I had a margin on the outside of me, it would be the amount of space that I would have between myself and some other object or some other person, for instance. So if I want to be able to center a block level element that has equal distance space on both sides, then what I need to do is set it to have automatic left and right margins. And now if I'm using the margin shorthand, all right, this is margin shorthand. If I wanted to use margin longhand, I could say margin dash right, for instance, or margin dash left, right? That's one way of doing it, but I'm just going to go ahead and address all margins all the way around. And if you remember back from what I said before, margin is one of those properties that will take up to 4 different values, and it goes in a clockwise rotation. So you would have top. So for right now, let's just say top is auto, because I don't want to think about what top is, okay? Right now, it's applying auto all the way around because I haven't typed any other stuff. And then right would be the next one. So let's say that right is auto, and bottom would be the next one, so that would be auto, and then left would be the next one, so that would be auto. Okay, well, now we've got auto, 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 auto. An easier way of doing that, if you know that you want, let's say, for instance, the left and right to be the same and the top and bottom to be the same, then you can get rid of these last two values, and what happens is that the top and bottom take the first position, and the left and right take the second position. So let's just say, for instance, that I don't want the top of my articles all sitting right on top of each other. Okay, so what I can do then is for top and bottom, I can tell them that I can either do a percentage or M's. Let's say that I want to try 1M for top and bottom. And you can see that they get separated a little bit now and that they're sitting away from each other. I do want, however, for the left and right to stay as auto, because what it does when I do it that way is that it takes the given dimension, because I have told it how wide to be, it takes the width, whatever the current width of that article happens to be, and it will figure out whatever the calculated pixel dimension is, and then it takes the size of its parent, whatever its parent happens to be, and in this case, its parent is the section, but because we haven't told the section how big to be, it's taking up 100% of its parent, which is the body. All right, so basically it's taking the size of the body or the viewport, and it's subtracting the size of the article, which is 80%. So it takes 100% and it subtracts 80%. That leaves 20% left over, and so it automatically splits the remainder in half, and it applies 10% to the left and 10% to the right automatically. That's what it'll do. And so that's how you can center something that's block level. Now, if it's an inline element, you center it in a different way depending on what it is. But for block level elements, you can center it by specifying how wide it's supposed to be. So you need to tell it how wide it is, and then telling it that you want it to have left and right automatic margins. Okay, so let's just stick with that for a moment. And at least now you have a comprehension of how you can center some stuff. And maybe 1M isn't quite enough. Maybe I'd want to do something like, I don't know, 1.5. That's a little bit better. The other thing too is that, if we wanted to see how this looked on a larger screen, we could see how it looks on a larger screen, right? And don't worry about what this little blue outline is. That blue outline is what it was originally whenever we had selected it. So anyway, if I click off of it somewhere and we come back over here, you see that it refreshes itself. So it's not a big deal. But you can see that it resizes itself based on the size of the viewport, which is great because it's still always taking up 80% of the browser dimension, or 80% of its parent to be precise, but its parent is taking up 100% of the browser. So that's why that's working like that. And then if you wanted to put a max width, so that it doesn't get too wide. So like for instance, if I was on a really, really wide screen, if you don't want it to take up too much space, there is something else that you can do too. You could say that you want it to have a max width as well. And what's nice about a max width is that if you can't predict, you know, the size of someone's really large screen dimension, you could say, well, I don't really ever want it to get any bigger than a pixel dimension. So maybe you'd want to say that you don't want it to be bigger than, say, 1600 pixels wide. Well, because this is just in percentages, right? But you can tell it not to be any bigger than a fixed dimension as well. And in that case, what you would do is you would say how wide you want it to be, but then after that, you would say that you want it to have a max dash width. And you could say that you want it to be like 16, for instance, 1600 pixels or something like that. And then whenever that happens, it won't ever get any larger than 1600 pixels, all right? So it's not going to happen on my screen. Let's just do something smaller for illustration purposes. Let's say that it won't get any bigger than, let's try 1200 pixels and see. Actually, I can't even do that because my screen dimension is only 1280. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to say it can't get any bigger than 800 pixels, and then you'll see that it in fact does have its limitation and it will contain itself. So if I were to take my dimension and start to resize it a little bit, you see that it will resize until it hits that 800 pixel dimension, and then you see it just stops getting bigger, okay? But it does still stay centered. So just to reiterate, what you can do if you want to have a width and a max width is you'd set the width first in some sort of relative unit of measure, for instance, percentages, because percentage is always going to be dependent on whatever its parent is, right? So, and in this case, if we want it to be based on the viewport can always be rescaled and changed by the user. So we're saying we always want it to be 80% of the parent, right? But we also maybe don't want it to get any larger than a certain pixel dimension. And the reason for that, if you're not sure why, is that maybe you have a bunch of text inside, and in terms of graphic design rules, you don't want the text to get too long. Like if you don't want to have too many words per line. Otherwise, what happens is that people get reader fatigue, and they also just sort of look at long blocks of text and they just don't want to read them. This is a little daunting, like this is way too long. So you can tell it that you want to make it, you know, a certain size so that basically it would force the wrapping to happen sooner. So that's another reason. And then yet another reason would be like if you had an image in here that was scaled based on the size of its article container, then maybe you don't want the image to get too big because it might break down in its quality. So those are all some good reasons that you might want to set a max width. You can also set min width as well. But the thing is, you have to make sure that you set max width and min width after you set the normal width, because otherwise, if you set them beforehand and then you set width, width will override the max or min if it comes after them. All right. So this is something where the order of operations is actually important. All right, now I want to show you something else really quickly. You might have noticed that all of a sudden these bullets and these numbers popped up on the unordered and ordered lists. Now, they were invisible before because we had 0 margins, and what's happening on these is when we set the margin to 0, by default we never actually removed the list styling off of them, which would put bullets or numbers on them. This is still a default browser styling that's happening where these list items are getting some sort of bullet or number next to them. And by default, it wants to put them sort of in a padded area. We took the padding and margin off though. So we could remove that if we wanted, or if we decide that we actually want to keep them, which I probably am going to, then what's more important is that I would need to adjust this content so that it's not sitting right up on the edge of the article. So let's take a look at that real quickly, and let's talk about how we could do that. First of all, we already talked about margins and how those are on the outside. Well, we need to pad the inside of these articles so that the content's not sitting on the edge, and that's literally called padding. So if we wanted to come down here in our article rule and add a new line that's called padding, let's just do it so that we have padding all the way around. We could do top and bottom different from left and right if we want, but you're going to immediately notice here, let's see, as soon as I start typing something, you'll immediately notice what it looks like. If I type the first thing, the first unit for the value, it's going to automatically assume that that is applied all the way around. So we can see what it looks like. Let's say if we do 1.5 m, and all of a sudden it's a little bit better, but we probably want even more than that because of the way that the bullets are. And actually, the bullets don't matter because we can change the lists so that they're inset even more. That actually might not be a bad amount of space. Let's just see. The other thing too that you might want to consider is that 1.5m looks, or 2m looks okay here, but as we scale this out and the box gets bigger, the proportions don't seem quite right. Well, if you think about it, what we're doing here is we're scaling things in percentages, right? The width of this container, but then here we're talking about doing this in m's. So you could either do it in m's or you could do it in percentages, and maybe percentages is a better way of taking care of it. So maybe let's just see what 5% looks like. That's a little bit much, in my opinion. So maybe we could do, like, see what 3% or 4% looks like, maybe 3.5 even. 4% maybe is okay. All right, and then you can see that as we scale, oops, sorry, let me grab the edge of this. As we scale, that percentage actually does sort of become a little bit more relevant to the size of the screen. And you may or may not like that. So it's really up to you how you want to adjust that. We could leave that in a percent, or if you always want it to be the same, we can do it in m's. And let's try like 3m and see how that looks. And that might be okay. The only thing that you need to think about is if you scale it down, 3m still stays the same. It's not changing like it did in percentages. I actually tend to like this better using the m version, but I just wanted to show you that you could do that, and make sure you terminate that, of course. But I wanted to show you the difference between the different ways that you could do that. You could also put pixels here as well. That's up to you. But I generally tend to use relative units of measure. And I will say that m's and percentages are not the same. Percentages are true, like absolutely, truly relative units of measure because they're relative to something else. M's are sort of relative, but they're also sort of fixed. M's are relative to the size of the typography because an M, graphic design wise, is the amount of space that the letter M takes up. All right, and so if you've got a font that's really a huge wide font, then M's are going to look different than, say, if you've got a really condensed narrow font. But at the same time, that won't change based on, it's based on the size of the typography is how the M's work. All right. But pixels are pixels. It's based on a unit of measure that has something to do with your hardware resolution. Now, one other thing I want to show you really quickly, if we jump back over here, is that, remember, I don't know if you remember, but before, when we scaled this down, you always, no matter how small the screen got, you always had 10% on the right and 10% on the left from that auto margin, right? No matter what we did. But if you get small enough here, look what happens. Look what starts to happen. We don't have that extra margin on the sides anymore. And that has something to do with what happened when we added this padding. I'm going to just comment this out for a moment, and you'll see that it put the padding back when I commented that out. And you might be wondering why that happened. When I take it back off, there we go. That's because, we actually did have a lecture about this that you were supposed to watch. But that is because whenever you add padding to something without adding a rule for the box sizing to add it so that it has a value called border box, what padding does is it literally will grow the inside of an element, and it adds to the overall dimensions of that element, right? So if I were to inspect this, and I am just going to inspect it really quickly in my live view, so you'll see all these data brackets things. But if I go up here and I inspect my Let me find where it is, article, okay? I inspect my article. You can look down here and you can see what the rendered view is. You can see that the current width of the actual element is 624 and change, right? Pixels wide. And if you were to look at the actual size of the viewport, it is that is unchanging, but then you see the padding, it's adding 43 pixels of padding on either side in this current view. If I were to change this, the percentage makes it a little different, but you'll see that the padding is still the same, because remember 3M is going to be approximately 43 pixels, or in this case exactly 43.2 pixels, right? So it's adding that on both sides, so that ends up being an additional 86.4 pixels, right? And that makes a difference when you get to really, really small screens. And so if you want to make sure that your overall dimension doesn't change when you add padding to something, there is a rule that we can add that's called box sizing. And this is new to CSS 3. It didn't exist in CSS version 2. So it works really well with HTML5, you know, but it doesn't really work with older versions of HTML. But since we're only worried about HTML5 as a version, then that's all we're really working with, then this is going to work just fine. So what I'm going to do, instead of adding the rule here, I actually want it to be true for everything in my entire document. So I'm going to go back all the way back up to the top where I've got a reset rule, and I'm going to create another reset rule. And what I'll do is, instead of adding like a bunch of these individual, you know, things where I keep adding body, H1, H2, and so on, what I can also do is I can add an asterisk, which it's called a wildcard. It's like the everything selector. I'm going to make everything have something called box sizing. Oops, box dash sizing, like that. And we're going to say that we want border box as the rule. And what that does, okay, what that does by telling everything in the page to have box sizing of border box is that it allows it to absorb the dimensions of padding and border that are added to an element, and it will actually make it part of the overall dimension that you told it to be when you told it how wide to be. So for instance, if we go down here, all right, we added padding, and what happened is it got bigger. Remember, it actually got bigger. But because now we're telling everything, including this element, right, to have a box sizing of border box, what it means is that when I say that I want it to be a width of 80%, or in this case, or in some other case of a max width of 800 pixels, but I want it to be 80%, then it's not going to be 80% plus 86 pixels when I add padding. It'll be an overall 80%, and it recalculates what the actual padding ends up being, and it recalculates what it has to do to the inside of this to make it work right. So if I come back over here, all right, and you can see that I start to come down lower. You see now whenever I get my screen really narrow, no longer does it collapse because it's applying that border box. All right, it adjusts how fast or how soon my content inside has to wrap. That's all it does, okay? So anyway, it keeps that overall exterior dimension of 80% instead of making it bigger. And you might look at that and wonder, you know, why does that seem so important? It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it actually really is, especially like if you have to have a bunch of things sitting side by side on the same block, and you need them to take up an exact amount of space so that they will all fit on the same line. Then if you add padding, that can throw everything off unless you use that border box value. And anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and end this here, and we're going to move on about how we can continue styling and formatting this stuff.